2006 saw the largest protest in U.S. history. Over 2 million people across the country took to the streets for immigrant rights.
I was very concerned. There was just a huge absence of black immigrants and African Americans. And as a black immigrant serving or working in the African American church and community, that was pretty alarming to me.
My concern in 2006 was that the immigration issue was an issue very dear to African Americans, especially during the campaign for democracy and civil rights and Dr. King. Immigration was one of the key issues that was important for dismantling racism.
We began to realize that absence and that silence is a result of a gap in the immigrant rights movement. And that gap was that we did not bring in the race and economic piece. And in the end, we then realized that there is a direct connection between the ongoing civil rights movement or struggle and the current immigrant rights movement or immigrant rights struggle. And through the difficult conversations and the deep discussions that we have, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration was born.
Well, the way we look at immigration is that you can't talk about immigration unless you talk about racism and globalization and the impact that that has had on all our communities. It's clear from the debate and the discourse on immigration that there's a white supremacist framework. And in fact, when we talk about, in the media, they talk about, quote unquote, the browning of America and the threat to Anglo-Saxon culture. You see that a racist discourse is being consolidated in a right-wing white supremacist core is being developed that threatens not only immigrants but African Americans.
So the major problem with the anti-immigrant movement is that it undermines and effectively reverses the gains of the civil rights movement. African Americans historically fought for their rights in this country, and what we're seeing is that the same forces that fought so hard to oppress African Americans are now extending their fight to immigrants, and primarily immigrants of color. So they're criminalizing immigrants, they're dehumanizing them, calling them illegal, and these are just folks who are here working hard, trying to provide for their family. Yet we see corporations benefiting from their labor. And what we're also seeing is that these same corporations that have imprisoned African American communities in this prison industrial complex are now extending their reach, and they're extending their resources and building detention centers to basically imprison immigrants of color. And so we see these connections in our communities where African Americans and immigrants of color have to come together and have to combat these corporations and the collusion with the government that isn't protecting everyday people.
The Black Alliance for Just Immigration primarily was formed to talk to African Americans about some of their questions or distrust around immigration or immigrants, and answer some of the questions that get put out, particularly in the media, trying to pit one group against another.
So in African American communities, we're seeing a lot of unemployment, very high unemployment if you look across the country. And many people blame that on immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, but immigrants in general. And what we as BAJI say to that is that it really is the corporations and the businessmen that are benefiting from that. Immigrants are being locked into a very exploitative system and being super exploited, and African Americans are being locked out of the formal economy. And what we say is that it would benefit both groups if immigrants and African Americans would come together and fight for social and economic justice for all of us.
The United States immigration policies began with slavery. That at the core of the immigration issue in the United States is cheap labor.
Before the early 20th century, immigrants only had to answer a series of questions and pass a medical examination. The immigration process took about 4 hours. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was closely followed by the 1917 Immigration Act, excluding all Eastern Asian and Pacific Islander immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1924 ensured that 90% were from Europe. For example, in 1924, there were over 10,000 immigrants from the Caribbean, and in 1925, there were only 321.
There's a lot of similarities that we faced, back in the day with the African American community in terms of the racism, and especially here in California, where Asian Americans, were the largest minority for a long time. That there were lynchings, the Chinese communities were driven out and they were run out of town. Their communities were burned. They were basically, so San Francisco became a safe haven for them, but they were basically run out of many places in California, Oregon, and Washington on the West Coast. And so in some ways they were treated, horribly in the same way, that many African Americans and other Africans have been treated on this continent. So the 1965 Immigration Act made equal the number of people who could immigrate from different countries. And we owe this huge debt of gratitude to the work of the civil rights movement, exposing the racism inherent in the U.S. government's institutions, like the immigration system.
Today, instead of having national quotas, preference is now given to relatives of citizens and to elite professionals, multinational executives, people holding graduate-level degrees, and investors. On the contrary, the immigration process for working-class people takes 5 to 20 years.
The struggle around immigration is not just a struggle within the borders of the United States, but it is about the challenge of global migration. It is about the challenge of the fact that people are moving all over the world. And people are moving all over the world because of exploitive and destructive trade policies.
Because we implemented NAFTA in the mid-1990s, they knew there was going to be mass migration due to the loss of jobs. What has that meant for Mexico? It has meant the loss of over 6 million jobs, and over 6 million workers tied to agriculture have fled the farmlands in rural Mexico into the United States. So you can see a very direct correlation between our economic penetration and infiltration of that economy. It has translated into massive migration.
Many migrants courageously leave their families, their homelands, and make the dangerous journey due to poverty, war, and natural disasters. Most of the migration in today's world is caused by the forces of economic globalization and foreign aid policies based upon the privatization of resources for the wealthy.
What motivates my work has little to do with the fact that I went through that experience. It's more of a political framework of the continuing injustice. It's the injustice based on not understanding the reasons why people leave home in the first place. Mine may have been war, but a lot of times it's economic hardship. Continuing economic crisis that is happening all over Africa, when people, particularly young people, feel they don't have any more choice. They don't have education. They don't have any prayer in hell for getting a job. No opportunities for starting their own businesses. Absolutely dismal in terms of any hope.
Black immigrant communities in this country have actually been criminalized for a long time. Because when they walk down the street, people don't go, "You're an immigrant," they go, "You're black." And so driving while black has been hitting the black immigrant community for a really long time. Even just the whole idea of how do we check people, and if we're gonna check immigrants, so where I live there are Jamaican undocumented students, and there are Jamaican undocumented people as long as Haitian and Dominican. It means that then everyone is a target, right? Because if everyone looks black and everyone looks the same, that means whether or not you're a U.S. citizen or you're undocumented, everyone's getting targeted. And so the increased rates of people in the juvenile incarceration system and in people in the criminal justice system are going to keep rising.
Secure Communities is a fingerprinting sharing system between ICE, the FBI, and local law enforcement agencies, so Alameda County here. And basically, whoever gets fingerprinted, you get arrested, you get booked, and your fingerprints go through the system. So it's a catch-all. So everyone who gets arrested, gets booked, gets put into the system. Victims of domestic violence have been deported because of this. I've heard reports of citizens being deported because of this. And they're doing it under the guise of safety, but there's nothing really safe about it. It's actually making communities a lot more fearful of the police. People don't want to report crimes because they know, especially with something like Secure Communities out right now, you don't have to do anything to get deported. So yeah, it's just, again, this not being able to trust the police as well. That's something Black people felt for a very, very long time, and this is something that ESCOM is creating within immigrant populations. And on that note, I think African Americans need to care, because especially in a place like California, we are the minority, and they're attacking the majority right now. And after, when they're done attacking immigrants, I mean, who's to say we're not next?
So what we see as part of our success is that more and more African Americans are beginning to see the common interests between our community and Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander immigrant communities, and vice versa. We've done a lot of educational work, we've done a lot of media work, and we've reached thousands upon thousands of African Americans across the country.
BAJI helps to support local campaigns, such as the anti-SB 1070 campaign in Arizona. BAJI helped with a campaign in rural Louisiana against a strawberry grower who exploited workers from Latin America.
Charles Reland has held their passports illegally to force them to work for lower than legal pay.
You've held their passports and refused to return them.
They got their passport.
You have threatened to deport them for attempting to take breaks during the workday.
Get the passport. Just shut your mouth and let me go get them. Okay?
Reland did as promised. He retrieved the passports but then drove away, leaving the workers on the highway.
The national campaigns that we've been involved in that have been successful was for temporary protected status for undocumented Haitians that President Obama granted right after the earthquake. We had been working with a coalition of groups around the country for over a year to push first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration to grant that status so that undocumented Haitians could stay and get work permits. We also worked with the Liberian community around the country to get the Obama administration to renew their temporary protected status. And so we're very proud that we worked with both of those communities and with groups around the country to make that happen.
We're a very little organization with a very big agenda. And the big agenda is the things that we get brought into, whether it's interfaith stuff, and the part of it's because we're the only all-Black group in the country that does this work. BAJI is the one who says this is an issue of racial justice. Who is getting harassed here? I mean, think of all the white people in the Bay Area who don't have papers. And where's ICE? That's not seen as a problem. So it seems that only the colored immigrants, and usually the poorer ones, closer to the grassroots, are the ones that are getting all the attention, and they're identified by race. And that's why, but BAJI's one of the few groups anywhere in the country that actually puts that out that way.
And I believe that our best years are ahead of us if we keep before us this purpose of continuing to fight injustice, continuing to fight discrimination and exploitation. It is not just about legislation. That is not our destination. Our destination is complete liberation for all people.